Owen Calloway checked the oil pressure on the Peterbilt at 5:30 in the morning, the way he had done every morning for 11 years, his breath fogging in the November air above the hood of the truck. The garage at Calloway Transport sat at the edge of Sudbury's industrial corridor, between a recycling depot and a frozen food warehouse, and at that hour it smelled of diesel and cold concrete and the burnt coffee he kept in a thermos on the workbench. He wiped his hands on a rag, tucked it into the back pocket of his canvas work pants, and went to start the second pot. His daughter called at 6:45, which was unusual. "Dad, are you coming to the dinner on Saturday?" I said I would, Owen said. "Bring something, okay? Bethany's making her chicken thing and I don't want it to be awkward if you just show up empty-handed." He told her he would bring wine. She told him not to bring the cheap kind. He told her he didn't know what kind was cheap anymore. She laughed and hung up, and Owen stood for a moment with the phone in his hand, looking at nothing in particular, then walked back out to the Peterbilt. He was not a man who spent much time thinking about what he had or didn't have. The garage was his, fully paid. The house on Elm Ridge Road was his, fully paid. The 3 trucks were his, and 2 of them were running well, and the third needed a new clutch assembly, which he had already ordered. He lived simply because he found simple things sufficient. He ate breakfast at the same diner on Regent Street every weekday morning, ordered the same 2 eggs and brown toast, tipped the same $2, and drove himself to work in a 2009 Silverado with a cracked passenger side mirror that he kept meaning to replace. Nobody in Sudbury who saw Owen Calloway on the street would have guessed anything particular about him. That was, in its own way, something he had cultivated deliberately, though he rarely thought of it in those terms. He wore Carhartt jackets and work boots. He shook hands and remembered names. He did not talk about money, he had a lot of it. The dinner on Saturday was at his daughter Claire's house, a semi-detached on Bancroft Drive that she shared with her husband, a man named Preston Holt who worked in commercial real estate and who had, in Owen's assessment, a gift for making every room slightly smaller by entering it. Preston was 39, wore a blazer to casual dinners, and had a way of mentioning his deals in conversation the way other men mentioned the weather, as though it were simply the ambient condition of being him. Owen arrived with a bottle of Cotes du Rhone he had asked the woman at the LCBO to recommend. Claire hugged him at the door. Preston shook his hand with both of his, the way salesmen do, and told Owen he was looking well. "You're still running the garage?" Preston asked, not long after Owen sat down. "Still running it," Owen said. "Must be tough in this economy. Diesel going where it is." "We manage," Owen said. Preston nodded, the way people nod when they have already moved on to the next thing they want to say. "I keep telling Claire's dad he should think about selling. Real estate on that corridor is going to jump. That whole stretch between the depot and the warehouse. Somebody's going to buy it and put up mixed-use residential. I've had 2 clients ask me about it." Owen poured himself a glass of water. "I'll keep that in mind." There was a woman at the table that Owen hadn't met before. Bethany introduced her as Carolyn Stokes, a friend from her yoga class, recently divorced, lived in the Flour Mill neighborhood. Carolyn was in her early 50s, dark-haired, with a directness about her that Owen found refreshing after an hour of Preston. She asked Owen what kind of trucks his company ran, and when he told her long-haul freight, she asked him how the driver shortage was affecting operations, which was not the question most people asked. Most people asked if he drove the trucks himself. "I used to," Owen said. "Drove the Vancouver run for 6 years. Retired myself to the office eventually." "Do you miss it?" He thought about this honestly, which was another thing he didn't often do out loud. "I miss the Rockies," he said. "The stretch before Kamloops early morning. Nothing else like it." Carolyn smiled. She had a daughter in Calgary and a son finishing his engineering degree at Waterloo. She asked Owen if he had other children besides Claire. He told her it was just Claire, and that her mother had passed 8 years ago, and Carolyn said she was sorry and meant it, which he could tell. By the time Preston started explaining cap rates to nobody in particular, Owen and Carolyn had migrated to the kitchen under the pretense of finding more wine. "He's always like this?" Owen asked quietly. "This is actually him restrained," Carolyn said. "Bethany says last Christmas he printed out a comparative market analysis as a conversation starter." Owen laughed, which surprised him. He hadn't laughed at a dinner table in a while. They saw each other twice in November, once for coffee at a place on Elgin Street that Carolyn liked, once for a walk along Ramsey Lake that turned into 2 hours without either of them noticing. Owen drove her back to Flour Mill, and she said she'd enjoyed it. He said he had too. He meant it. By December, they were seeing each other regularly. Carolyn was easy to be with. She didn't fill silence with noise. She had opinions and defended them calmly. She ordered what she actually wanted off menus and didn't ask Owen to weigh in on it first. He found he liked her more each time they met in the straightforward way that he liked things that worked well. Without drama, without ceremony, without the need to explain why. She met his shop manager, a man named Terrence Hobbs, who had worked with Owen for 14 years, and Terrence told Owen afterward with the bluntness that was his primary communication mode, "She's too good for you." "I'm aware," Owen said. "Don't mess it up. I'm trying." What Owen did not tell Carolyn, not in November and not in December, was anything beyond the surface of what he was. He told her about the garage and the trucks and Claire and the years he'd spent on the road. He told her about his wife Janet and how she had been the one who insisted they buy the house on Elm Ridge even when they couldn't quite afford it, and how she had been right. He told her ordinary things, true things. What he did not tell her was the rest of it. The rest of it was this. His uncle, Hugh Calloway, had built Calloway Resource Partners from a single gravel pit outside Timmins in 1971. By the time Hugh died in 2019, the company held aggregate and mineral rights across 4 provinces, managed 3 active quarry operations, had a logistics subsidiary that processed over $120 million in annual contracts, and was structured across a network of holding companies that Hugh had spent 40 years building, with the quiet, methodical patience of a man who trusted very few people and needed even fewer. Hugh had never married. He had no children. He had one nephew, Owen, who had spent 15 years working with Hugh directly before quietly stepping back, at Janet's urging, to run his own operation at a scale that felt human. The estate, when Hugh's will was finally settled in early 2020, was valued at a shade under $2 billion. Substantially, all of it went to Owen. Owen had told almost no one. He continued to run the garage. He continued to pay Terrence's salary and fix clutch assemblies and drink the same coffee from the same thermos. He made donations through a numbered company and let his accountants manage the rest. He did not need people to know. He had, in fact, found that the knowing changed things in ways he didn't like, changed the way people looked at him, the way they laughed at things he said, the angle of approach in every conversation. And so he had simply decided not to introduce that variable into his life unless he had to. He was not sure yet whether Carolyn was someone he had to tell. He was still thinking about it. January arrived with the kind of cold that Sudbury produces when it wants to remind you where you are. Owen had the 3rd truck's clutch sorted by the first week of the month, which put him in a better mood than January usually allowed. He and Carolyn had settled into something that felt, tentatively, like a pattern. Dinner on Wednesday, something on the weekend, calls in between that lasted longer than either of them planned. It was on a Wednesday in late January that she first mentioned Philip, not by name initially. She mentioned that she'd heard from someone she used to know, an old friend from before her marriage, and that he'd reached out after seeing something of hers on LinkedIn. Owen asked what kind of old friend. She said without apparent difficulty that they had dated briefly in their 30s, and that it was a long time ago and that he was just reaching out to say hello. Owen said that was fine. He meant it, mostly. Philip Stanton, as Owen eventually understood him, was the kind of man who arrived in rooms with his credentials preceding him. He ran a wealth management firm in Toronto with offices on Bay Street, drove an S-Class Mercedes, and had the particular confidence of someone who had been told, many times over the course of his life, that he was exceptional. He had been divorced twice. He had no children. He called Carolyn twice in the 2 weeks following that first mention, and by February he had made 2 trips to Sudbury, which struck Owen as a significant expenditure of effort from a man with a Bay Street calendar. Owen did not say this. He was not a man who said things like that. What he noticed, because he noticed things, was the small ways in which Carolyn began to edit herself around him in February. She mentioned things Philip had said. She mentioned the dinner in Toronto he had taken her to. She mentioned once, with a careful casualness, that Philip had a place in Muskoka and had offered to have some people up in the summer. Owen fixed himself another coffee and asked how the dinner was. She said it was good. She paused. She said Philip was very attentive. "Good," Owen said. "That matters." She looked at him for a moment as though she was waiting for something else. He didn't provide it. Not because he didn't feel it. He felt quite a lot quietly, in the way that he felt most things, but because he was not going to compete, and she was not something to be won in a competition. In March, she told him she wanted to slow things down. She was kind about it. She said she wasn't sure she was ready for something serious, that she needed time to figure out what she wanted. She said she valued him, and that was true in her voice. But it was also the kind of truth that arrives just ahead of a door closing. He thanked her for telling him directly. He drove home, put the kettle on, and sat at the kitchen table without turning the light on, the way he had sat in that same chair after Janet's funeral when the last of the relatives had finally gone. He did not call anyone. He went to bed. The spring came the way it comes in northern Ontario, reluctantly in increments, dirty snowmelt at the road margins and mud along the shoulder of every secondary highway. Owen put his attention back into the business. The logistics subsidiary that managed the quarry contracts had flagged an inefficiency in the northern run that was costing them roughly $40,000 a year in fuel and overtime, and Owen spent 3 weeks in April sorting it out himself, driving up to the Timmins site, talking to the site managers, renegotiating a staging arrangement with a local hauler that cut the loss nearly in half. He liked this kind of problem. It was the kind that had a shape and a solution and stayed solved. Terrence asked him once, during that stretch, how he was doing with everything. "Fine," Owen said. "You don't look fine." "I'm fine, Terrence." Terrence gave him the look that 14 years of working together entitled a person to give. "She wasn't wrong for you." "No," Owen said. "She wasn't. You could have told her." "Told her what?" "You know what?" Owen considered this for a moment, honestly. "Maybe," he said. "Wouldn't have changed anything." Terrence made a sound that suggested he doubted this but was choosing not to pursue it. Owen went back to the fuel calculation. He heard about it from Claire the way he heard most things about that circle of people, imprecisely through a layer of second-hand detail, delivered with the particular energy of someone who is not sure how the recipient will feel. "You know Carolyn is seeing someone," Claire said, during one of their Sunday calls in May. "I knew she was seeing someone in February," Owen said. "Well, it's more serious apparently. He's some financial person from Toronto. Bethany says he took her to Iceland." "Iceland," Owen said. "For a long weekend he must be doing well." "Sounds like it," Owen said. There was a pause. "Are you okay, Dad?" "I'm fine, Claire." He was fine in the way that people are fine when something hurts, but the hurt is proportionate and they have sufficient practice with hurt. He put the phone down and looked out at the backyard, where the birch trees had come in and the grass needed cutting, and he stayed there for a while without thinking very much. What he didn't know then, what he learned considerably later, and in a context he did not expect, was that Philip Stanton's wealth management firm was not doing well. Had not been doing well for some time. 2 significant client funds had posted losses in consecutive quarters. An internal compliance review had flagged anomalies in fee structures. Philip had been managing this quietly, with the practiced composure of a man who had learned to perform confidence so convincingly that it had long since become indistinguishable even to him from the real thing. Owen did not know any of this in May. He met Marcus Webb at a Northern Ontario Business Association luncheon in June, which Owen attended the way he attended most things, because Terrence had signed him up and it seemed rude to cancel. Marcus was in his late 40s, ran a consulting operation based in North Bay, and had a directness that Owen respected. They ended up at the same table and talked for most of the lunch about aggregate pricing and Northern Ontario infrastructure gaps, which was the kind of conversation Owen found genuinely interesting, and which most people would have found deeply dull. Marcus knew of Callaway Resource Partners. "Hugh Callaway's company," he said, without elaboration, watching Owen with the kind of calm appraisal that meant he had already done the arithmetic. "That's right," Owen said. "You ran the logistics side of it." "For a while," Owen said. Marcus nodded. He did not pursue it further, which Owen appreciated. They exchanged cards. Marcus called the following week about a potential contract arrangement on a highway rehabilitation project in the Salt that had a significant aggregate component. Owen pulled in his site manager from Timmins, and they spent most of a Wednesday working through it. The numbers were reasonable. They agreed to proceed. It was through Marcus's network. casually, at a dinner in North Bay in early July, that Owen attended only because Marcus had specifically asked him to, that Owen first encountered Philip Stanton. Philip was there as the evening's guest speaker on portfolio diversification for resource sector businesses. He was polished in the way that Owen recognized immediately as the polish of someone who had built it deliberately. Good suit, good watch. The kind of easy authority in front of a room that gets confused with competence. Owen sat near the back and listened. He noticed 3 things over the course of 40 minutes. The first was that Philip's advice was generic in ways that a specific audience would eventually notice. The second was that when a man in the second row asked a pointed question about fee structures in commodity-exposed portfolios, Philip redirected with enough skill that only someone who had expected a specific answer would have clocked the evasion. The third was that Philip's assistant, a young woman named Haley, who was managing the presentation from the side of the room, checked her phone twice with an expression that Owen recognized as the expression of someone who was watching a problem they couldn't discuss in public. Owen did not introduce himself to Philip that evening. He left when the dinner concluded, thanked Marcus for the invitation, and drove back to Sudbury on the 17th. He made 2 calls the following day. One was to a former colleague of Hughes, who now sat on the board of a pension management firm in Toronto. The other was to his own attorney. He was careful. He was not in a hurry. What came into clarity over the following 6 weeks was not a surprise exactly, but it was more straightforward than he had expected. Philip Stanton's firm had drawn from a discretionary fee pool in ways that did not precisely align with the terms disclosed to clients. Not dramatically, not obviously, enough that a careful review would have found it immediately, but most people don't commission careful reviews of their own financial advisors on schedule. Among the clients affected was an elderly woman named Norma, who had been referred by Philip's first ex-wife and whose retirement savings had been managed under terms she did not fully understand. There were others. 17 others, as it turned out, by the time Owen's attorney had communicated the findings to the appropriate parties at the Ontario Securities Commission. Owen did not pursue this. He provided the information. He left the pursuit to people whose job it was. He did not tell Carolyn. He saw her once in August by accident at the Timbercroft Farmers Market on Paris Street that he went to on Saturday mornings for the tomatoes and the bread from the Mennonite baker on the East End. She was alone. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She saw him from across the aisle between the vegetable tables, and she stopped, and then she walked over with the composure of someone who had been composing this moment in advance. "Owen," she said. "Carolyn," he said. They stood for a moment in the crowded aisle with people moving around them on both sides. "I heard things haven't been going well," she said, "with Philip. His business." "I heard something similar," Owen said. She looked at him directly the way she had from the beginning. "Were you involved in that, the review?" Owen considered the question. "I passed along some information," he said. "Other people made decisions with it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't know what I was getting into with him." "I know," he said, and he did. That was the part that had never made him angry at her. "I made a mistake," she said, which cost her something he could tell. "You were looking for something," Owen said. "That's not a mistake. The man you were looking for wasn't him. That's disappointing, but it's different." She looked at him with an expression that was complicated and that he didn't try to interpret too precisely. "You're very calm about this. I've had time," he said. There was a pause. She said she should get going. He said he should too. He meant it, but he didn't move immediately, and neither did she. And for a moment they stood in the middle of the Saturday morning market with bread and tomatoes in their hands and the ordinary world moving around them. "Could we get coffee sometime?" she asked. I'm not asking for. I just think I'd like to talk." "I'd like that," he said. And this too was true. The way most things Owen said were true. Plainly, without performance, without anything extra attached. He did not call her the next day, or the day after. He thought about it carefully, the way he thought about things that mattered. Carolyn was not a problem to be solved. She was a person he had liked, and still liked, and who had made a choice that had cost her something, and who had come back not asking to reverse it but simply to be honest. That struck him as worthy of the same honesty in return. He thought about the conversation he should have, eventually, about the rest of it. About Hugh, about the estate, about the holdings and the holding companies, and all the things that had made his life more complicated than a man with a cracked passenger side mirror had any reasonable cause to expect. He thought about how it would change the conversation, and whether that was avoidable. He decided that it was not avoidable, and that the point was not to avoid it, but to say it in a way that made it clear. The thing he was offering was not the money, which was simply a fact about him, and not the version of himself with the money, which didn't exist, but the same man who had fixed the clutch assembly in February and driven the Rockies for 6 years and sat in the dark kitchen after Janet's funeral and meant what he said when he said almost anything. He called her on a Wednesday evening. She picked up on the second ring. "I've been thinking about what you asked," he said. "About coffee." "Yes," she said. "I'd like to do that," he said. "But I think, before we do, there are some things I should tell you about myself that I've been putting off telling." A pause. "Okay," she said carefully. "Nothing bad," he said. "Just things that are true about me that I should have said earlier and didn't know how." She said she understood. He said they could talk it through over coffee if she wanted, or he could tell her now, whichever she preferred. She said now, and he could hear in it that she meant it. The same directness that had made him like her in the first place. He stood at the kitchen window looking out at the birch trees, dark now against the August sky, and he told her the truth about himself from the beginning. Not the dramatic version, not the version with the number at the end given weight and significance, but the ordinary version, in sequence, the way things had actually been. Hugh, and the gravel pit in Timmins, and the 15 years learning a business from the inside, and Janet saying they should buy the house even when they couldn't afford it, and the estate, and the decision, which had been easy actually, to go on being the same person he had been before it arrived. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that he wondered if he'd misread it. Then she said, "You drove the Rockies alone every week for 6 years, and you didn't think that was the most important thing to lead with." He laughed. He hadn't expected to laugh. "The Rockies are good," he said, "before Kamloops especially." "You'll have to show me sometime," she said, and there was something in it, cautious, hopeful, not overstating itself, that Owen recognized as the same register he tried to operate in, meaning it, but not too much, offering it but not pushing. "I'd like that," he said. He stayed at the window for a while after they hung up, with the night coming down over Elm Ridge Road and the birch trees going from dark to invisible, and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest he usually got to contentment. In the morning he drove to the garage at 5:30, checked the oil pressure on the lead truck, and poured himself a coffee from the thermos on the workbench. The work was there, the way it always was, and so was the morning, and he started.